Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for a continuation of our series discussing clinical trial research and equitable breakthroughs in medicine development. We're delighted to have Dr. Priscilla Pimu and Tisha Harris joining us tonight to discuss barriers in participating in clinical trials. First, good evening. I'd like to start with an introduction. Dr. Pimu.
Hello, everyone. My name is Priscilla Pemu. I am a general internist, professor of medicine at Morehouse School of Medicine, where I also serve as associate dean for clinical research. It's really great to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Pemu. And Tisha Harris.
Hi, I am delighted to be here with all of you this evening. I'm Tisha Harris, and I am one of the clinical research leads on the Equitable Breakthroughs in Medicine project, and work very closely with the team out of Yale University School of Medicine. Thank you so much for having us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, let's get started and discuss the importance of clinical trials. From each of your perspectives, why are clinical trials essential for the advancement of medicine, particularly in communities of color and rural areas?
Tisha, do you want to go first?
No, why don't you start?
Okay. So, all of the treatments and cures that we have, the way they usually develop is someone has a great idea, they think something works. The only way to really figure out if it works is to do a clinical trial. And so in this day and age where we're becoming more and more aware of how the ways in which we differ and how when you take medication, you can have side effects and different things, it becomes even more important to make sure that everyone who's going to be using that medication is represented in some form during the testing of the intervention, whether it's a medication or medical device, whatever that looks like. It's really important. What I'll ask is if you've known anybody who has had an unusual response to a treatment that's been out there that other people are using. If you have, I think most people have, they have those encounters. I think that underscores why it's really important, one, to have clinical trials, and two, to make sure that when you do have those studies, that you have representation of the people who are likely to use that treatment in the clinical trial, because that's the only way you find out how they might present with side effects, complications, whatever that looks like.
I'll just add one of the other really important reasons, in addition to the discovery process itself, is the uptake. We saw this so much in COVID. One of the primary questions post-vaccine approval was, were there people like me in that clinical trial? And so there's so much value, not only in really having that understanding as a therapeutic or a device is moving through the approval process of not only the effectiveness and the potential for, side effects or unexpected adverse events or other things, but it becomes so important now in this day of information access to be able to say that there were people like me who participated. And like me means so many things, not just race and ethnicity, but thinking about geographic diversity and other things that make up who we are as a population.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you for that insight. And when you talk about access, I want to bounce it back over to you. What are some key barriers preventing participation in clinical trials, especially for communities of color?
Yeah.
Tisha, you want to go?
Sure.
Go?
I'm happy to go. I mean, there's just There's so many. I mean, I think, we often think of the usual, like, transportation or access to the trial center and other things. But, one of the things that's so important that one of the ministers in our partnership often reminds me of, he'll say, if someone is worried about whether they're going to lose their house or they don't have food, then clinical trials participation won't be at the top of the list. And so thinking about so many social determinant sort of barriers is a huge part of participation, and the barriers. Thinking about access in ways of, especially if you think about some of the more complex trials, like maybe oncology, people have to take a time off from work, or they might need even someone to go with them because they're so ill. They need a care provider to go with them. And that means two people have time away from work or childcare or other things. And so when you think about the barriers that prevent so many people from participating, there are a lot of really complex barriers to solve for. But I still say one of the largest barriers to participation is simply just not being asked, and making sure that individuals really have the knowledge and the information, so that as individuals in the community, we can go in and say, hey, I would like to understand about this clinical trials, and I'm armed with the knowledge to know to ask the questions, because you may not be, your provider might not in a 15-minute encounter think about all of the clinical trials that might be right for you and make the offer. And so that's a huge barrier that we're working to overcome as well.
I completely agree with those barriers. And I think that one that is really critical, that I think the approach that EQB Med is taking will address, is the one about mistrust. People not understanding the process, not knowing what it means, or a lot of the conversations around people's concerns based on history, based on other people's experiences, based on, I hear Tuskegee a lot. So just concern that they are putting themselves in a position that's vulnerable, and they're not really sure that their interests are going to be paramount. We feel like, and there's evidence, that when clinicians, practices, people who have an existing trusting relationship with their patients are the ones who are doing these clinical trials, it changes what the experience is for the potential participant, because they're comfortable, they can ask questions, what is this, doc? They have a relationship, it's a longitudinal relationship. And so that helps them. So besides that trust issue and creating those opportunities with people with whom they already have a trusting relationship, to be where they get to access clinical trials, I think just knowledge about what studies are out there, what studies potentially could help. So providing that education out in the community, so people know when they have a health condition, that there potentially is a clinical trial that could be helpful and where they could sign up. So sharing information about those things. One of the other barriers that I've heard about recently that I hadn't actually thought about, and this came from a lady, so she does a lot of activism with sickle cell disease. She has family that has sickle cell disease. What she shared was there's a lot of anxiety when you do end up making the decision that you want to participate, getting through the qualification process to be on the clinical trial creates a lot of anxiety that sometimes can be off-putting, or the thought that I really, really need to be on the active intervention. I don't want to be on the placebo. That can be a barrier. And then if you do get to be on it, the concern that when the study stops, are you going to continue to have access? So those questions come up as well, in terms of how people think about taking part in clinical trials, think about clinical trials and all that.
Now, going back to, historical mistrust, how do you, Dr. Pino, how do you feel that has kind of, I guess, evolved into less participation in clinical trials?
I think that we know what people's lived experiences are even in the present time. And so that continues to have an impact. We feel that, the more you have people understanding how to interrogate a clinical trial, working with people that they feel they can trust to ask questions about the clinical trial, then people feel a little more comfortable approaching a clinical trial, which is why I mentioned previously placing these studies with clinicians who already have a trusting relationship. I remember during COVID, Tisha, you were sharing that. Our experience was at that time, I guess early in 2020, nobody knew anything. We had a lot of contacts from our community partners, our community advisory board. They were reaching in to ask us questions because they trusted that whatever information we would give them would be something that they could, take and run with. So whenever there is a trusting relationship, show people, explain to people in a meaningful way how to look at a clinical trial, informed consent form, be comfortable having the ability to ask questions, what to look for. The informed consent forms are very detailed, they provide a lot of information. So people understanding what it takes, how to participate, I think dissipates some of that mistrust. The other element for us is making sure that the team that's doing the work is also diverse. And so for us, it's training people, whether they be investigators or research coordinators or other research staff, the monitors, to be people that's in the community. That way, they're talking to their auntie, they're talking to their neighbor, they're talking to their uncle. This is no longer a mystery. People understand what goes on. And so there's less of that, oh, this is a black box, I don't know what they're going to do, going on.
Absolutely. Tisha, earlier you noted that one of the barriers is just getting asked to participate. Can you touch on as well cultural sensitivity and how can clinical trials be made more inclusive to address those specific needs of minority communities?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the really exciting aspects of EQB Med is building on everything is very much sort of meeting people where they are. And that's really focused on, sort of the informational aspects, but it's also focused and rooted in deep partnership. And so part of addressing the specific issue of being asked and the educational barriers, making sure, number one, the sites are equipped and thinking about all of their clinical trials materials, thinking about the way they ask and how they ask and who they ask and who's asked, and who's doing the asking, but in a way that meets the individual, both from a language perspective and from a cultural sensitivity perspective. And then I think the other exciting thing about our community partnerships is our community partners are helping us think about things in a whole new way and helping us think about how to reach individuals. And that might be, not only thinking about modification of materials or other things to be culturally appropriate. A lot of people think about going through institutional review boards or other things. I have to make sure that this is in the right language. But they don't think about the subtle sensitivities related to culture. And so having that view from the community, just saying, no, this isn't how we're going to get through. We're not going to break through to the Black community with a direct-to-patient message that hasn't been modified. Let's modify this, pamphlet, and let's take it to the church. Let's take it to the beauty shops, because it's really the women who drive the healthcare in the house anyway. So we get this really great sort of view of how to really reach everyone in the community through the eyes of those who know the community best as part of the partnership. And so I think that those are the most successful when you think about how to modify and adapt from a cultural perspective. And you're going to get this great insight from your community partners and your clinicians in the community who know best. And so that's a really exciting part of what we're doing, is really amplifying that lesson learned and those partnerships as part of the work we're doing in EQB Med.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that insight. Dr. Pramod, do you have anything you'd like to add?
With respect to cultural aspects?
Mm-hmm.
No, I think she said it really well.
Agreed. So going more into EQB Med, Equitable Breakthroughs in Medicine Development, how are they addressing logistical and cultural barriers specific to that project?
I'll start and Tisha can finish it out. Does that sound good?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So with EQB Med, I think the first step is, as Tisha mentioned, meeting each practice where they're at. So some practices, what they all have in common is that they do have an existing relationship with their patients. That's a trusting relationship. But there are different levels in terms of experience with doing clinical trials, infrastructure for doing clinical trials. So EQB Med brings this unique way of assessing each practice so that you can define whatever interventions we're going to do to support the practice are tailored to their needs, as well as the practice saying, hey, these are my aspirations. Before we started the program, Tisha was sharing some of that insight from one of the sites that she's visiting currently. And so there's a co-creation component in addition to a very, very tailored set of supports depending on what the practice needs. And so if it's a practice that, for instance, does not have ways to outreach within that community, then the support would be there's like national experts, the community ambassadors, trusted messenger programs that will find people within that community to support them in their outreach to the community. If it's a practice that already has those relationships, then maybe what they need is some structure around how they engage, the tools that they use to engage and things like that. So that initial assessment helps in defining what the need is and then developing the supports for that so that the practice feels like it's well grounded within that community with the relationships it needs to understand what studies people care about, what things the people want to participate in, so that when they're picking studies, it's not just, I'm going to do this study because. You're picking the studies based on what the community has shared as something that they're interested in doing. Tisha?
Yeah, those are, fantastic points. And starting with that assessment and thinking about the aspects, there's also the sort of operational side. And so again, it's really about meeting the sites, where they are. So the example of the site that already has the relationships with the community and community partners, they may also then need, because we are conducting clinical trials. And so there's the rigor and the quality required while the practice considers, growing and strengthening and moving towards those aspirations. They want to do that with the same quality and care that they provide clinically. And so how are they going to do that? Do they need additional systems, or the systems that they have have they been set up to do clinical research? Or maybe the staff need some additional training because they've been primarily focused on clinical care. And now they've got to, they need to move and think about how to integrate that clinical trials component into the practice. And so that's really, this tailored approach lets us approach each practice in a unique way. But while we're still approaching it from a unique perspective, we're also focused on how can we replicate this? How can we sustain this? Because we obviously want this to grow. We want to include more practices, more communities. And so everything has to be tailored, but sustainable and scalable. And so it's really been exciting to begin to see these phenotypes develop, to begin to see. We were sharing with one of the our new sites in Texas that they picked up the phone and called the site in Georgia for guidance. And so it was awesome to also see this new community developing around this work and this sort of organic partnership between the sites, because those are the things that really will make this community sustainable and keep the work going.
Yes. That is so very exciting. So another partner, some faith-based organizations with EQB Med, what do you see as their involvement and how they can encourage participation in clinical research?
You want to go, Tisha?
Yeah, sure. This is one of my favorite parts of the partnership. It's funny because it's based on a lot of the work that we had started at Yale with the African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches in Connecticut. And we did these focus groups and people said, how are we going to reach the Black population? And so in the focus group, we heard from the community, go to the church. They said it won't be perfect. Not everyone goes to church, unfortunately, in our community. But what we do know is that pastors generally are trusted. People in the community respect and feel like they have our best interests at heart as community leaders. And so if they can trust that there's a process that's going to protect the community and they see benefit for the community, we're going to trust the things that they say. And so the really exciting thing with our faith-based partners, Choose Healthy Life and the Conference of National Black Churches, which represents the 6 largest Christian denominations, 80% of the Black Christians in the U.S., which is very exciting, is that we really have that input. Some of the pastors have said, they do 3 services a Sunday. They speak to thousands of people every Sunday. And in addition to just the church audience themselves, they have membership, they have educational programs, they have outreach programs. And so by partnering with them, they're really able to magnify the message of, clinical research participation, addressing a lot of misinformation and disinformation in a way that it would just be impossible for us at the site or the clinical level to speak to the community in a different way. And so the partnership really just allows us to bring that new perspective in, and not just for the community. A really important thing about EQB Med is now that these leaders have had the clinical trials training, they're actually taking their perspective and now they're able to share it with the industry sponsors who are bringing the clinical trials. So really being a conduit for lifting up that community voice. And so we're really excited about that as a partnership aspect, because they bring not only that lived experience, but these vast networks of messaging that they're able to help us with and to address some of these issues that we've been talking about.
Wonderful. Yeah. Dr. Pimo?
What she said.
Okay. Love it. Oh, fantastic. Okay. So let's go into diversity within clinical trials. Why is it crucial to have diverse representation? And then what are the implications of underrepresentation?
I can take that.
Yeah, I was just about to say that.
Okay. So I have a favorite example, a few. There's a drug called Plavix. You ever heard about it? Clopidogrel? In general, that medicine is used when a person has a heart attack or a stroke. It's a medicine that prevents your platelets, which is the tiny little cells in your blood that start the blood clot. That's what keeps us from bleeding out every day. And so when a person has a heart attack, basically what happens is, in addition to narrowing, there may be a blood clot that's formed. And so when the doctors go in, the heart doctors go in, they can put in a scaffold, which is a stent, to open the vessels back up. When they do that, they have to leave the scaffold in. What your body does when it senses something foreign is it tries to clot it, it's resisting it. And so you take, Plavix was developed as a way to prevent clotting of that stent. Okay. And so the studies were done, great results. It came out in use. And then there were people, usually it was people of Hispanic descent and some others, like Polynesian people. They would take the medicine. They had a stent, but they would come back to the emergency room with chest pain, which meant the stents had clotted back up. And, at first the thought was, did you really take the medicine? Yes, we took the medicine. And so it turns out that the way the Plavix is when you take it, it's in a pro-drug form. Your body, there's enzymes in your body that convert it into the active form of the medicine so that it can do its job. Well, the people who were coming back with chest pain had a version of that enzyme that didn't do the work. And so they would take the Plavix and it would go right through them. It didn't become the active form. It stayed as the pro-drug. If maybe we had had a few people with that version of the enzyme in the clinical trial, it would have been picked up sooner. That's my clearest example for why it's really important to have different kinds of people. We're more alike than we're different. But in the places where we're different, it can matter depending on what the medication is, what the intervention is that's being tested. And so that's the basic argument for why it's really important to have a diverse pool of people when you're testing out an intervention. People who are likely to use that intervention, they should be represented in the testing of the intervention.
Absolutely. Wow. What an extremely poignant example. Tisha, do you have anything you'd like to share from that perspective too?
What she said.
Awesome.
We should take this show on the road. What she said.
Right.
Yeah. So great. So in this world of technology and how it figures and filters into clinical trial research, what do you think the role is of technology in improving access to clinical trials, especially for our underserved communities?
I can start. I'm really excited about the role technology can play. I mean, it's helping us tonight to reach, thousands of people, and the three of us are in 3 different locations. And so I do think that there's really important roles for technology to play. One of the exciting roles, as an example, with the electronic health record, a few of our sites want to optimize that to help reach their population. And so as a patient, you think about, I'm in my portal because I've got I need a prescription refill. And there could be messaging and information about clinical trials. And that's one way, especially if it's optimized for language and culture, that it might reach some people. What I think is also an important aspect of technology is the role that it can play for the sites. It's really important for the sites to be able to track everything they do, to make sure that they're getting paid for all of the work that they're doing, tracking the operations of their clinical trials. And also with thinking about how we might maximize some of the real world data. I think one of the things, though, that we're always cautious about, especially as we think about EQE Med and other things, is technology is not a silver bullet. And I say that all the time because I think there was, especially, you know, in the early days of COVID, thinking, well, we could just do all of this virtually. And there's certain communities that really are not yet trusting of technology in a lot of ways. I think a lot of trials that are really dependent on technology, they also begin to create another barrier. If someone has like a limited phone plan with limited minutes or limited data plans, and we have a lot of technology and a lot of surveys, then we have created another barrier for their participation. And so I do think there's incredible promise in technology. I just think that it's something where we really need to think about every tool that we're using carefully and make sure that it's actually fit for purpose. And that's been another focus of EQE Med as we look at some of the technologies and the partners that we have at the table. Is this system really right in this community? Have they thought through all of the needs that our various sites will have? Is it something that really the community themselves will embrace and utilize as part of the toolkit for clinical trials? And so it's been really exciting to be able to make sure that we're really thinking about those things and helping each site think about it from the perspective of the patients that they serve and partner with.
Awesome. Thank you.
So I completely agree with what Tisha has shared. I think that, so there's something that we do know is that when there is an advancement that changes health outcomes in a really great way, it also increases the gap between the haves and the have-nots, or it broadens disparities in health outcomes. And so technology has huge potential and huge promise. I think it's really key that as we use technology, you know, when it's new, when it's really great, it's expensive, it might be out of reach from the practices, from the site, from the people themselves who are potentially going to use it, as Tisha kind of laid out. So I think that as we think about technology, we have to be aware of that possibility so that we can make sure that it doesn't become an issue. But speaking about how technology can help clinical trials, I think that using technology to collect patient-reported outcomes is a huge opportunity. So rather than what we measure, where they have to come in and get this test and get that test, remember all the conversation around how much time it's going to take to do certain things. Technology can let you measure things wherever you are. There are things that are currently in use that some people may be familiar with, people with heart failure, for instance, where you have a scale at home and you stand on it, and someone remote from you can look at what your weight change has been and tell you how to change your medication and things like that. So those things can make it more convenient. Technology can make it more convenient, make it more likely that people can participate, but we have to be thoughtful about how it's applied, I think.
Yeah, if I could just add one specific example that always comes to mind, it's one of the funniest in, you know, my entire research career during COVID. One of the things that we were focused on, there was a real perception that seniors, especially Black seniors, would not adopt technology, and so they would really be left behind. And so we had one of our ministers said, well, let's just run a pilot. I think that there's not the uptake because you haven't put the time and energy into helping them. And so he had a pilot. He arranged for our team to go out to the church and have iPads for them and showed them how to use the patient portal, how to do electronic visits, and how to sign up for the clinical trial and do the reported outcomes that would be a part of it. And of the 9 seniors that were a part of the pilot, 8 of them signed up for the clinical trial that day. So it was, I think one of the important aspects of technology is not losing that human touch. What might it take for a specific community or a specific population to adopt that technology, to be able to benefit from it? And so, that's another, I think, exciting piece, because when you have those partners who can say, no, I disagree with you. It's just, we need to modify the way we deliver this specific aspect in order to really maximize the impact. And so those are sort of the exciting things that happen with our partnerships, much like our partnership with Cobb tonight and helping us reach this huge audience.
Yes. The network is quite incredible. Dr. Kinu, you focus and elaborate a lot on patient-centered care. Could you give us more insight to that and how it supports clinical trial participation?
Okay. I think that at the heart of person-centered care is communication. It's communication that takes into consideration the needs, the culture, the aspirations of the individual. So, from the top, when we started, we talked about barriers, we talked about trust, mistrust, we talked about access, being asked, we talked about maybe not being aware of resources. I feel very strongly, and there is evidence to back it up, that when people are approached in a way that's person-centered, if we set up our studies in a way that's person-centered, if we set up healthcare in a way that's person-centered, it changes the experience of the individual. It makes them feel empowered. They can take decisions, they can query things, they can move forward and not be at the mercy of some juggernaut. To my mind, when you approach anything with a sense of empowerment, then you're more likely to be positive in your engagement. You're more likely to be motivated. You're more likely to do what works for you and fits with your aspirations as an individual. So yeah, that's how I feel about it. We do a lot of work teaching and practicing how to be more person-centered in everything that we do. When people feel like you see them, you hear them, then they can engage in a very meaningful way for a sustained period. Then it's not a transaction where they're in and out, but they come back because they feel like they're seen, they're heard, and it makes sense for them to be in that setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Tisha, could you share more about the Yale Cultural Ambassadors Program and its impact on diversifying clinical trials?
Yeah, I could talk about them all day. I wish they were here with us, because it's so much more impactful to hear our community leaders speak about the program. But they really transformed the way that the institution, both the hospital and the medical school, think about not just the clinical trials and the clinical research, but practice and the mission and everything. And when we first started the program now, 16 years ago, with very skeptical conversations, because they felt like it was a very much transactional relationship. There's research to be done. Yale came into the community, they might have partnered, but when the research was over, they felt like the partnership ended there. And so it was really important to have a relationship that was not grant-based, that was not project-based, where there was a commitment from the university to the community and the community leaders that this is going to be an enduring partnership. And that's where it started. And so one of the really exciting things was the community leaders said, we need training. If we're going to be partnering with you, we want to really understand these clinical trials. And so with that, when we started, we were around 2% total participation in clinical trials, at much smaller number of trials and much smaller numbers of overall participation. And now it's around 30, 35%. has been for many years of the total participation in clinical trials at around 35,000 individuals who are participating in clinical trials. And where those ambassadors are directly engaged and directly committed to the clinical trials, some of the numbers have been upwards of 90% participation. And it really came from the idea that the partners at the church and the partners at Junta for Progressive Action, which is a Hispanic serving community-based organization that already had the trust of the community, could really move the needle, not only with that messaging to the community and bringing research out to the various community locations, but really helping us to address that culture gap. So how can we make sure our research is meaningful and make sure that what we are saying is impactful, and then making sure that we're saying it in a way that the community are prepared to hear it? One of the exciting things the AME Zion ministers did was they partnered with a local radio host, and they host a radio show twice a month where they integrate a physician and they talk about research, they talk about mission, and they bring it directly to the community, but in a way that it hadn't been done before. And so it's been a really exciting program. And they really bring fresh ideas and challenge the investigators in the institution every day to do better. And so that's a lot of what they have been able to achieve, and the success there has been brought to bear as part of how we think about some of the relationships and partnerships in EQB Med.
Wow, there's so many wonderful variables to this program and the partnerships. What about sustainability? How can we ensure that participation is not just increased on a temporary basis, but over time?
Do you want to start that? Do you want me to?
Sure. I think that just the structure that we set up that takes into consideration practice characteristics, connections with the community, connections with the sponsors, and enhancing the process from the site perspective as well as from the sponsor perspective is a way to make sure that this is not just a one and done, that it continues into the future. So if you just picture what this could look like, right? A site within a community, that site starts out in the learning phase. They take on one or two studies. They're able to kind of look at their learnings with respect to the studies. They're recruiting from their community. The community partners help them in that process. They develop materials that makes meaning for that community. The site takes on studies that the community says they're interested in. And when the studies are done, people have experienced what it's like to take part in the study, and they can share their own specific experiences with their friends and family. So that's like word of mouth. And then the site, because of what EQB Med has set up as part of the ecosystem with the sponsor front door, a site is not just going to have one study to do and then it's done. They're going to have an opportunity to look at other studies to take on. I feel like it develops capacity for the site. They're hiring from within that community. The people who take part in the studies live in that community. And so that, the process perpetuates itself. I think that clinical trials also have a business component to it. So for the sites, knowing how to do it efficiently, and Tisha had kind of alluded to this earlier, make sure that the business of it is favorable to them, also guarantees its sustainability into the future.
Yeah, and if I could just add, another important element that Joshua Primo just alluded to is that partnership with the sponsors. One of the, I think, the exciting things for us, even coming together as a group to apply for this, was having the conversations with our funder, Pharma, about how important sustainability would be, and making sure that we all had a plan going into this. Like, how are we going to make sure this is sustainable? And knowing that there was a commitment to that sustainability. And then another part of EQB Med, I think, is in addition to the portal and the front door, direct conversations with the pharma companies. We actually presented to a large group of the member companies talking about EQB Med, helping them to know these sites that many of them are newer to some of the sponsors. They had not known the site's capabilities prior to EQB Med. And so helping to really uplift the sites of EQB Med to the pharmaceutical partners, and then having those pharmaceutical partners understand that it might take maybe a transition in the way that they're thinking about things or doing things to make sure that clinical trials are inclusive. And so I think that also is adding to the sustainability of this is those new partnerships and our ability to message on behalf of the sites to pharma and its member companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So another component of sustainability, as well as the younger generation, how would you encourage younger generations in minority communities to participate in clinical trials?
So I think, first of all, from a workforce perspective, making sure people know about the careers that exist in clinical trials and clinical research. Clinical research pays fairly well. There are different career paths within clinical research, and I've been hearing a lot from people that they did not know that these career paths were an option. And so making sure that there's an awareness of what those career paths are. I mentioned earlier, from being the principal investigator to being research study coordinators, to being research nurses, to being research staff, all of those roles. That's one, right? When you're in the workforce, when you're next to something, when you see how it works, it increases your awareness and your comfort with it. And then, within our groups, as we're doing outreach to the community, make sure that it's a broad-based outreach, because there's a difference between what, if the young people, if the older people, you can reach them through church, you might not reach the younger people in the same way. So being very intentional in the way that we fashion the community outreach, so that the younger community or the younger community organizations are also intentionally brought to the table in this engagement. An example that I can share about that is with our Clinical Research Center Community Advisory Board. We have our research engagement lead that's very focused on the young people. And so he goes out, they're doing these research talks across the AU Center. The young people are very interested in becoming knowledgeable, becoming empowered. And so they take on different things that they're working on. So providing them opportunities to speak, to participate in educational opportunities. I mean, look at Montague Cobb. We have the Montague Cobb Scholars Program, providing that avenue for people to get the information about clinical trials, I think, is key. And then, of course, there are the health conditions that do tend to affect younger people, making sure that the information is out there about what the opportunities are to participate in clinical research for those health conditions.
Yeah, I agree 100%, and we've actually seen it. We one of the partnerships that we have, I mentioned the church, and as they were looking around in COVID, they said, wait, we're all older. And so how are we reaching all of these young people who have doubts about the work?
I'm not old. What you talking about?
Yeah, that wasn't my language. That was from the Reverend.
I'm just kidding.
That was from the Reverends. I'm not old either. I started doing research when I was 5. So
right.
what they did was they recruited young ambassadors. And so they have a young ambassadors program. And so the young ambassadors come up with ideas for how they want to communicate and reach people. And so one of the things that they did as an example is they host events partnered with sororities and fraternities. And they have done social media influencer campaigns with us where they're selecting influencers who are young, who represent the population that they're specifically looking at. And then we have our internship program where we're reaching early high school and college kids. And the purpose is that career outreach. But they actually have come up with campaigns that are specifically targeted at pediatric populations so that kids who are children of color have something that's more culturally aware so that it can help them think about whether they might want to participate in a pediatric trial, obviously with parental permission and all of the things that come with it, but making sure that the kids even understand it. And so I think it's really a lot about making sure we have this really broad tent. And that's what we've really been focused on with EQB Med. How can we make sure that we're really reaching everyone where they are?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we wrap up for this evening, what are some practical steps for participants? So what can people do if they're interested in participating in clinical trials, but maybe they face challenges like location or resources?
So first, figuring out if they have a health condition, if a person has a health condition and they want to know if there's a clinical trial for that health condition close to where they live, you can go on clinicaltrials.gov. I always mix it up. .org.gov, clinicaltrials.gov. And you can search by condition. You can put your zip code in there, studies that are actively enrolling, and you'll see all of the sites that are close to you so that you can kind of know, you don't have to wait for someone to ask you. You can actually reach out and say, hey, call that number that's on that site and say, I'm such and such, and there's a study that I'm interested in participating in. Now, a lot of sites, for people participating in studies, if there's a transportation issue, if it's working out hours so that, people with young children, they have to bring their kids along or things like that. You can have those discussions with the staff at the site when you call. And then there are studies that they're known as decentralized. So pretty much if it's that kind of study, they might just come out to you to do what you need. One of the other resources that I heard about recently, so if there is an advocacy organization, so for instance, for lupus, the Lupus Foundation, or for sickle cell or any of those, or epilepsy, whatever that health condition is, there are advocacy organizations. So if you're having issues, maybe with transportation, with childcare, there's the opportunity to reach out to those for that kind of support as well. But I would say if you're going to go to a site to participate, that's your first kind of place to ask about, because there are more resources than you would know that's available.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before we go into final thoughts, I just want to say thank you for your time tonight and all the great examples and just practical insights that you shared with us, both of you. So Tisha, I will ask you for final thoughts. What message would you like to leave with our audience about the importance of participating in clinical trials and supporting equitable medical breakthroughs?
I think especially this audience, one of the things that I really hope is there's a shortage of providers in the clinical trial space, especially providers of color. And so if you are an active clinical practitioner, to think about participating in clinical trials as a PI or as a co-I, getting experience and being open, because I think really one of the ways that we're going to make research more equitable is to have more people who look like us, who are participating and who are thinking about and bringing their lived experience. And so I'd love to see your entire audience think about how they can be involved in the clinical trial space and help with awareness, even if they're not ready to be a PI. Be aware of clinical research and be willing to suggest participation and share information with the patient community.
Absolutely. Dr.
I
Finger,
agree.
your
I agree. I would say for us with EQB Med, it's a learning phase. And, Tisha, something you said just jogged my consciousness. This is an audience. Is your audience primarily physicians?
It's open, so
Okay.
recorded and it's open to
Okay.
the public and physicians.
Okay. So I would love to hear from people what kinds of experiences they've had, whether it's engaging as a clinician doing clinical research or as a person participating in clinical research. If they have feedback for us on what those experiences are and potentially how EQB Med could help that, we would love to hear about that. I think that the pace at which new treatments are being developed for everything is blistering. And so, standing on the side and not participating, I think guarantees that we continue to see the health inequities that we're so concerned about. I would encourage people to give it a thought. If you have questions, ask them, empower yourself. But I think that it's really important to find a clinical study to participate in, get yourself in the process and see what it's like and how we can actually change lives.
Awesome. Thank you again so much. Thank you for our audience tonight for this, the Cobb Institute and barriers to participating in clinical trials as we continue to discuss the EQB Med project. And we will be back next month. Have a great evening.
Thank you.